December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay silent beneath a thick coat of snow, its trees standing like frozen sentinels in the pale morning light. A column of German vehicles crept toward a recently captured American fuel depot, engines barely running, exhaust mist hanging low in the icy air. The smell of burning fuel drifted across the clearing where dozens of metal drums lay scattered, some ruptured by artillery, others stacked neatly as if waiting for an army that no longer controlled them. A German general stepped out of his staff car and surveyed the scene. Tank crews hurried with hoses, siphoning what they could into half-frozen jerry cans. Officers barked orders to refill the panzers, but even a quick glance at the numbers told another story. Too little fuel, too many delays, too far still to go. The depot was a prize, yet it looked nothing like salvation. Snowflakes drifted across the general's field map as he realized the truth settling like the cold itself. This offensive could never reach the Rhine, let alone Antwerp. And as he stared at the dwindling fuel barrels, he understood why this moment carried such weight. We must step back into the months that shaped it. In the autumn of 1944, Germany stood on the edge of collapse. The victories of earlier years, blitzkrieg triumphs in Poland, France, and the opening phases of Operation Barbarossa, felt like memories from another world. The Wehrmacht that once drove deep into continents now retreated toward its own borders, battered by months of relentless fighting. After the breakout from Normandy and the disaster of the Falaise Pocket, German formations that survived carried the scars of a shattered army. Missing tanks, missing trucks, missing divisions that would never be rebuilt. On the Western Front, the Allies had advanced with astonishing speed, overrunning France and Belgium, reaching the Siegfried Lines sooner than German command ever imagined. What the world saw as a triumphant Allied surge, the German high command saw as a ticking clock. Every month, the pressure tightened. Every month, resources dwindled. At the center of this crisis lay a single, crippling problem: fuel. Germany's war machine had always relied on synthetic fuel plants to compensate for its lack of natural oil resources, and by late 1944, American and British bombers had reduced those plants to twisted metal. Production had collapsed. Armored divisions received fuel in rations so thin that tank crews often trained by pushing their vehicles to conserve precious drops. Trucks sat idle for lack of gasoline. Artillery batteries waited for horse teams that no longer existed, and even elite panzer units found themselves unable to maneuver except in short, desperate bursts. Commanders on the ground spoke openly of an army that could still fight but could no longer move. Yet in Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere was not resignation but defiance. The Führer insisted that Germany still possessed the strength for a decisive blow in the West, an attack so bold it would catch the Allies off guard and reverse the momentum of the entire war. His idea, first whispered in the summer and refined by September, became Operation Walk dem Rhein, a plan that many of his generals viewed with a mixture of disbelief and dread. The objective was not modest. It called for breaking through American lines in the Ardennes, sweeping across the Meuse River, capturing Antwerp, and splitting the British and American armies apart. The Allies would be forced into negotiation, or so Hitler believed. Victory would not come from incremental gains, but from a single, overwhelming stroke. The Ardennes had been chosen for specific reasons. The terrain was rugged and heavily forested, historically judged unsuitable for large-scale offensive action. That same assumption had led American planners to treat it as a quiet sector, defended by divisions that were under strength, inexperienced, or recovering from previous battles. Hitler saw opportunity in this complacency. Surprise would be total. Weather, he calculated, would ground Allied air power, neutralizing their greatest strength. Panzer divisions, 1 SDSS Panzer, 2nd Panzer, Panzerlehr, and others would strike with concentrated force, driving through thin American lines before reserves could react. But beneath the confident rhetoric, German generals recognized a fatal flaw running through the heart of the plan: fuel. The distances involved were immense. To reach Antwerp, Armored columns would have to push more than 150 kilometers through difficult winter terrain. Germany possessed nowhere near enough fuel to support such an advance, unless they captured it. Fuel depots, Allied stockpiles, abandoned trucks, these were written directly into the operational timetable. The success of one of the largest offensives of the entire war depended not on Germany's industrial capacity, but on the hope that American supply officers had stored their fuel in places German tanks could reach. It was a gamble so extraordinary that some German staff officers privately wondered if it bordered on fantasy. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly warned that the offensive lacked realistic logistics. Walter Model expressed similar skepticism. Otto von Manschenfeld, commanding 5th Panzer Army, later recalled that even during planning, he understood the offensive could not reach Antwerp. The question was whether it could inflict enough damage before fuel shortages brought it to a halt. But Hitler's enthusiasm overrode objections. The order was given. The divisions assembled, and the forests of the Ardennes filled with tens of thousands of German troops, waiting for the signal to strike. Across the lines, American commanders patrolled a sector that felt calm, even sleepy. They could not yet know that the fuel they stored so casually behind their lines had become the hinge upon which Germany's final offensive would turn. By late 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had created a logistical burden unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever experienced. The rapid breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, and the sweeping push toward the German frontier carried American forces hundreds of miles beyond their original supply bases. Everything, ammunition, food, winter clothing, spare parts, and especially fuel, had to travel along roads that were never designed for such volume. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system, raced day and night to keep frontline units moving. Yet even with its relentless effort, fuel remained a constant concern. To maintain momentum, planners positioned large fuel depots wherever the advance naturally slowed, believing these locations would remain secure. One of those quiet rear areas was the Ardennes. To the American High Command, the Ardennes was precisely the kind of place where the front line breathed. Its thick forests and steep valleys created a natural barrier that discouraged large-scale offensive operations. Throughout the campaign, the region had served as a rest zone for divisions recovering from combat, training new replacements, or rotating out for warmth and resupply. Weeks before the German attack, it housed units like the 106th Infantry Division, fresh, inexperienced, and expecting nothing more than routine patrols. Fuel depots, truck parks, and maintenance workshops rested behind these lines in areas deemed safe from any serious threat. American intelligence assessments reinforced that sense of security. Reports suggested that Germany was exhausted, its divisions under strength, its panzer forces drained of vehicles and fuel. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Ultra intercepts revealed growing desperation within German logistics. And while analysts detected signs of troop movements and radio silence across the German front, these indicators were explained away as defensive preparations. Few believed Germany had the capability to launch a major offensive, and even fewer imagined it could do so in the harsh terrain of the Ardennes during winter. This misjudgment created a dangerous alignment. Allied fuel reserves sat in large, easily accessible depots within a region that lacked strong defensive depth. Barrels were stacked along roadsides, stored in open fields, or concentrated at key junctions that supported the broader Allied supply network. Officers managing these depots understood their importance, but had no reason to expect a sudden enemy breakthrough. They followed routine security measures, not wartime emergency procedures. The closest German armored units, they believed, were too fuel-starved to attempt anything ambitious. Meanwhile, on the other side of the lines, German planners studied these very depots through captured maps, reconnaissance reports, and interrogations of prisoners. The fuel dumps were not just incidental targets, they were lifelines. The operational plan relied on them. Without securing American fuel, the German offensive would grind to a halt within days. For this reason, Certain road networks and villages were marked with special importance. They were not just waypoints on the path to the Meuse. They were potential sources of the fuel needed to reach it. Allied commanders, however, did not view these locations through the same lens. Their concern lay in pushing toward the Rhine, clearing the Siegfried Line, and preparing for future operations inside Germany. The Ardennes, with its deep woods and narrow valleys, felt like a place where war paused rather than escalated. Even when small clues surfaced, intercepted messages, unusual German prisoner behavior, movements of panzer divisions into reserve, few officers saw these as warning signs. Many believed the Germans were incapable of offensive action in winter conditions. Others assumed any major attack would strike in the north, near the Ruhr or the Aachen corridor, where the strategic stakes were clearer. As a result, the fuel, equipment, and supply depots scattered across the Ardennes remained exposed in a way no one fully appreciated. They represented the immense logistical strength that powered the Allied advance, but also an unintentional vulnerability. When the German artillery barrage opened on December 16, 1944, and armored columns surged through the morning mist, these quiet storage sites were thrust into the center of the war. The barrels that had been stacked for efficiency now became prizes of opportunity, battlegrounds of desperation, or flames rising into the winter sky as American troops set their own fuel alight to keep it from German hands. And in the chaos of those opening days, the race for fuel became as important as the clash of infantry and tanks. The offensive that Germany had pinned its hopes on would soon collide with the logistical backbone of the Allied armies, fuel that was never meant to be part of the fight, yet suddenly determined the pace and fate of the battle. Fuel lay at the very heart of the German operational plan, an invisible but decisive force shaping every decision before the first shot was fired. The planners understood the arithmetic clearly. A German panzer division consumed thousands of liters per day, even under ideal conditions. But the Ardennes was far from ideal. The route to Antwerp stretched more than 100 miles, demanding sustained armored thrusts across snow-covered roads and rolling terrain. Internal reports warned that Germany possessed barely enough fuel to initiate the offensive, much less sustain it. Yet Hitler insisted that surprise, momentum, and captured Allied fuel would compensate for these deficits. This assumption transformed fuel from a logistical concern into the most critical factor determining success or failure. Every kilometer was a wager. Every detour meant consuming fuel that could not be replaced. And as the offensive began, commanders soon discovered that even rapid breakthroughs cost more fuel than calculations predicted. Engines idled in long traffic jams, tanks struggled against slippery inclines, and units burned through reserves simply reaching the starting line. The fuel shortages were not a distant threat. They were embedded in the bones of the entire operation. Terrain added another layer of strain. The Ardennes was no open plain where armored columns could maneuver freely. It was a labyrinth of narrow roads squeezed between dense forests and steep hills. Winter made everything worse. Snow reduced traction, freezing rain turned slopes into ice sheets, and visibility dropped with little warning. Tanks and half-tracks crept along single-lane roads that twisted unpredictably through villages and valleys. A single disabled vehicle could halt an entire column, leaving engines chugging pointlessly as hours passed. German traffic control units worked tirelessly to keep the roads functioning, but the sheer volume of vehicles exceeded anything the terrain could reasonably handle. Attempts to reroute units onto secondary paths only consumed more fuel and time. These were not challenges that could be overcome through bravery or tactical skill. They were structural limitations that shaped the tempo of the offensive. Even in the opening days, when German forces surged forward with remarkable speed, the terrain extracted a constant, invisible toll on fuel and morale alike. Weather, ironically, played both for and against Germany. The heavy overcast skies that grounded Allied aircraft in the first days of the attack were essential to German hopes for surprise and maneuver. Without Allied fighter bombers overhead, armored columns could move with relative freedom, and artillery positions remained safely concealed. But the same low visibility, icy roads, and bitter cold imposed harsh penalties. Vehicles slipped, engines struggled to start, and fuel consumption spiked in the freezing temperatures. Snow muffled the sounds of movement, but also blanketed roads and landmarks, complicating navigation in forested terrain where even experienced drivers could lose their orientation. Worse, the weather delayed or confused units as they attempted to coordinate their movements. Timetables slipped, objectives were missed, and the carefully timed flow of the offensive began to fray. German officers feared clearer skies, not only because of Allied aircraft, but because improved weather would reveal just how slow their own progress had become. Amid these environmental pressures, a deeper strategic illusion took shape. The belief that the offensive could maintain momentum long enough to reach its distant goals. Hitler envisioned armored spearheads punching through American lines and racing toward the Meuse River before Allied reserves could react. But every mile advanced brought new challenges that multiplied rather than diminished. The terrain grew more constraining, not less. The resistance stiffened, not weakened. The promised caches of American fuel existed, but they were smaller, more scattered, or more heavily contested than German planners had hoped. And each delay, no matter how brief, tightened the noose around Germany's fragile fuel reserves. For the men inside the vehicles, tank crews huddled over engines, drivers gripping frozen steering wheels, mechanics fighting the cold with numbed hands. The consequences of these pressures were felt in the most direct way imaginable. They watched their fuel gauges with mounting anxiety, aware that a single wrong turn or prolonged firefight could mean immobilization. They rationed fuel with discipline and desperation, coasting downhill in neutral, shutting engines the moment a halt was ordered, siphoning whatever they could from damaged or abandoned vehicles. The offensive was a race against time, distance, and the physics of fuel consumption, and every participant understood that failure could come not through enemy fire, but through an empty tank. These three forces, fuel limitations, unforgiving terrain, and harsh winter weather, formed the first set of angles shaping the German offensive. Together, they created a battleground that was far more complex than simple maps or arrows could reveal. And as the German advance pressed deeper into the Ardennes, these pressures tightened, bringing the offensive closer to the moment when logistical reality would collide with strategic ambition. For the soldiers on the ground, the Ardennes offensive was not an abstract plan drawn on maps. It was a daily struggle measured in exhaustion, cold, and the constant fear of running out of fuel before reaching safety. German tank crews, already hardened by years of war, found themselves confronting a new kind of enemy, the fuel gauge. Each time the needle dipped closer to empty, tension rose inside the steel hulls. Drivers coaxed their machines forward with delicate throttle control, trying to conserve every possible drop. Crews huddled around engines during halts, listening for the slightest irregularity, aware that even a minor mechanical failure could immobilize a vehicle they no longer had the fuel or parts to repair. Mechanics siphoned fuel from wrecks, heated frozen jerry cans over small fires, and drained trucks that had broken down along the roadside. Some units resorted to pushing vehicles by hand across short distances to avoid starting the engines. Meanwhile, on the American side, depot workers and truck drivers awoke to the realization that their supposed rear area had become a front line. Men who had never expected combat suddenly found themselves grabbing rifles, loading trucks under fire, or torching their own fuel stores to keep them out of German hands. Human emotion, fear, urgency, disbelief became woven into every decision involving the precious resource that both armies needed to survive. Above these men stood the commanders whose decisions shaped the offensive's course, and here the tension between ambition and reality became unmistakable. Hitler envisioned the Ardennes attack as a dramatic stroke that would reverse Germany's fortunes, restoring initiative and forcing the Allies into political negotiation. His conviction was unwavering, even as evidence mounted that Germany lacked the fuel, manpower, and industrial depth to sustain such an operation. Many of his generals recognized the danger. Rundstedt argued for a more limited offensive. Model questioned the feasibility of reaching Antwerp at all. Manschefeld worried that even the initial breakout required fuel reserves Germany simply did not possess. But each objection collided with Hitler's insistence that the offensive would succeed through audacity and willpower. The divergence between political aims and logistical capability widened into a chasm. The result was a plan that demanded perfection in execution, rapid breakthroughs, captured depots, uninterrupted momentum, yet depended on factors that could not be controlled. And as the offensive progressed, commanders in the field felt the consequences. They reported slower than expected advances, dwindling fuel, and growing American resistance. Yet the leadership above them continued to push for objectives that drifted further from reach with every passing hour. Meanwhile, the Allied response began to unfold with remarkable speed once the scale of the German attack became clear. At first, confusion reigned. Reports of breakthroughs, missing units, and German armor appearing behind American lines created a fog of uncertainty. But within hours, American commanders began to impose order on the chaos. Their priority was clear: deny fuel to the advancing German spearheads. Officers issued immediate instructions to evacuate or destroy fuel depots. Truck drivers raced convoys out of danger zones or set their vehicles ablaze when escape was impossible. Engineers blew up storage sites, scattering burning fuel across snowy fields and fountains of fire that lit the forest like torches. This rapid denial disrupted German expectations. The offensive had been built on the assumption that American fuel would be available in predictable quantities along the routes of advance. Instead, German units frequently found empty lots, smoking remains, or carefully guarded positions defended by troops determined not to let a single drum fall into enemy hands. At the same time, American divisions began to pivot, mobilizing reserves, reinforcing key towns, and establishing roadblocks designed to slow German momentum and increase fuel consumption. Every hour of delay, every additional firefight, every detour forced upon the German columns chipped away at their already fragile fuel reserves. These angles, human endurance on the ground, the widening gap between leadership aspirations and logistical reality, and the swift Allied adaptation, formed the second layer of pressure tightening around the German offensive. They revealed a battlefield shaped not just by weapons and maneuvers, but by the interplay of human limitation, strategic overreach, and the ability of an opponent to react with speed and clarity. Through these intertwined forces, the Ardennes transformed from a bold gamble into a desperate contest defined by time, fuel, and the approaching inevitability of exhaustion. Together, they pushed the offensive toward the point where aspiration would collide with reality, and where German commanders would confront the true cost of their ambition. In the first days of the German offensive, momentum seemed to return to an army that had long forgotten its taste. Columns pushed through American positions with surprising speed, exploiting confusion and seizing crossroads before defenders could organize. Among the units driving this advance were armored spearheads under the 5th Panzer Army and 6th SS Panzer Army, each racing toward key objectives that planners had marked as essential for sustaining progress. Fuel depots were among those targets, and when word spread that a sizable American depot had fallen into German hands, units surged forward with renewed determination. The scene that greeted them carried a strange mixture of triumph and urgency. American trucks abandoned in haste, stacks of fuel barrels half buried in snow, and the lingering smell of burnt petrol where retreating troops had tried to ruin what they could not save. German soldiers immediately set to work, dragging hoses across the icy ground, prying open barrels, and refilling every vehicle within reach. For a brief moment, the depot seemed to embody the optimism of the operation itself, a tangible sign that the fuel they desperately needed might indeed be taken from the enemy. But as German officers surveyed the site more carefully, excitement gave way to calculation and calculation to unease. The depot, though valuable, was smaller than expected. Some barrels were frozen, others riddled with bullet holes or ruptured by fragmentation. Fires set by retreating Americans had consumed a portion of the stock, and the rushed capture meant there was no time to sort, organize, or repair. Tank crews waited for refueling in long queues that snaked around wrecked vehicles and half-buried equipment. Engines idled in the cold, consuming the very resource they had come to retrieve. Staff officers compared the amount of fuel available with the distance still to be traveled, and the numbers refused to align. The depot might carry the spearhead another stretch of road, but nowhere near the promised distances of the operational plan. As one German general arrived to inspect the site, the gravity of the situation settled over him like the winter air itself. He stepped through the snow, past fuel barrels that clanged softly in the wind, and watched his men work with a mixture of efficiency and desperation. Everywhere he looked, he saw contradictions. Barrels filled with opportunity, yet surrounded by burning wreckage that testified to the losses incurred in reaching them. Tanks capable of striking deep into enemy territory stood nose to tail, wasting fuel as they waited for their turn at the pumps. Trucks that should have been transporting fuel forward stood crippled on the road, their engines frozen or damaged by artillery. The depot's value was vanishing in real time, drained by the delays, the conditions, and the sheer scale of the need. Even more troubling was the realization that this depot represented one of the better outcomes the planners had hoped for. If this was what a captured fuel site looked like in the best scenario, a depot found intact, seized quickly, and exploitable, then how could the offensive hope to maintain momentum across dozens of miles of winter terrain? The general knew the answer instinctively, though he hesitated to speak it. The offensive was burning fuel at a rate no one had predicted. The roads were too choked, the enemy too resilient, the terrain too unforgiving. Each detour, each skirmish, each destroyed bridge forced units to expend fuel that had not been accounted for. And now, standing among the very barrels that were meant to solve the crisis, he saw that the deficit could never be repaid. Reports from other sectors sharpened this sense of dread. Kampfgruppe paper, among the most aggressive spearheads, had seized small quantities of American fuel but found none in the large amounts required. Other panzer units reported that fuel reserves were already dangerously low. Vehicles were being abandoned not because of enemy fire but because their tanks had run dry. Crews broke open American jerry cans only to discover they were empty, drained by retreating troops. Rumors circulated of officers ordering fuel to be siphoned from command cars and supply vehicles into tanks simply to keep the offensive moving for a few more hours. As the general watched his men work, he recognized that the offensive success was slipping beyond reach. The Ardennes had promised concealment and surprise, but not the roads or the fuel needed for a long campaign. The plan had demanded that speed replace supply, that ambition bridged the distance between reality and desire. But speed had faltered, supply had dwindled, and the Allied response was growing stronger by the hour. The barrels at his feet might power one last push, one more attempt to take a crossroads or seize a village, but they would not carry an army to the Meuse, let alone Antwerp. In that moment, surrounded by the noise of refueling pumps and the distant rumble of artillery, the general understood that the offensive had crossed from bold gamble into doomed endeavor. The question was no longer how far the panzers could advance, but how soon they would be forced to stop. And as he turned back toward his staff car, the cold wind sweeping across the depot seemed to echo the truth that no one yet dared to speak aloud. Even captured fuel could not save the Ardennes offensive from its own impossible demands. As the German advance pressed deeper into the Ardennes, the initial burst of momentum began to erode under the weight of fuel shortages, traffic congestion, and stiffening American resistance. Columns that had surged forward with confidence now found themselves creeping through narrow valleys, trapped behind stalled vehicles or halted by unexpected firefights. Every delay imposed a cost that could not be measured solely in time. Engines continued to run, heaters stayed on in the freezing night, and tanks idled while commanders debated their next move. Fuel that had been so desperately sought from captured depots drained away through the simple act of waiting. The offensive, which depended on rapid and uninterrupted movement, had slowed to a crawl long before reaching its critical objectives. In several sectors, the German spearheads reached the outer limit of their advance only to discover that they could go no farther. Tanks that had fought their way to key crossroads or high ground suddenly ran dry at the moment when mobility mattered most. Crews converted their immobilized machines into static defensive guns, digging them into the snowy earth to hold positions that their engines could no longer defend through maneuver. Behind them, long lines of vehicles stretched into the forests, each one burning precious fuel that could not be replaced. Radio messages from unit commanders grew increasingly urgent. They requested fuel convoys that no longer existed, called for reinforcements that could not move fast enough, and reported enemy counterattacks that threatened to isolate entire battalions. The offensive was beginning to fracture, not through defeat in direct combat, but through the quiet, relentless pressure of logistical collapse. The turning point arrived as the winter skies finally cleared. For days, the Ardennes had been shrouded in fog and thick cloud cover that protected German movements from Allied aircraft. But when the sun broke through the haze, the battlefield transformed instantly. American fighter bombers swept across the region with devastating effect, hunting for columns that had become stuck on the cramped road network. Pilots spotted tanks jammed together, trucks abandoned in ditches, and fuel convoys struggling to navigate icy bends. The sound of engines overhead became a signal for German troops to scatter, diving for cover as bombs and rockets tore into the vulnerable highways. Vehicles that had been carefully rationing fuel were now destroyed before they could burn what little they carried. The clearing weather, once feared by German planners, now delivered the blow they could least afford. At the same time, American ground forces rallied with growing confidence. Patton's Third Army executed its famous pivot to the north, moving with remarkable speed across snow and ice to strike the southern flank of the German advance. Reinforcements poured into threatened towns, and improvised defenses stiffened into organized resistance. The relief of Bastogne demonstrated that the Allies had regained the initiative, and German commanders recognized the implications immediately. The window for a breakthrough to the Meuse had closed. Instead of racing toward Antwerp, their units were now fighting simply to maintain the ground they held. Each counterattack forced German forces to expend fuel they no longer possessed, and each maneuver tightened the supply noose further. The offensive's logic had reversed. Instead of advancing to seize fuel, they needed fuel merely to secure their retreat. Within German headquarters, reports arriving from the front painted a bleak picture. Reconnaissance units confirmed that American forces were strengthening positions along the Meuse, making any further advance impossible. Supply officers stated plainly that fuel reserves had fallen to critical levels. Some formations reported that up to half their vehicles were immobilized. Commanders who had once argued for caution during the planning phase now confronted the consequences of their warnings. The realization spread across divisions and corps alike. The offensive had reached its culmination point, and beyond it lay only exhaustion. For many officers, the moment of clarity came when they stood beside their own stranded vehicles. Panzer commanders who once commanded powerful armored formations now surveyed rows of tanks that could not move. They watched crews siphon the last drops from reserve cans, knowing that the effort would gain them only a few more kilometers. They listened to dispatches reporting that American forces were closing in from multiple directions, tightening around the salient that had once promised strategic transformation. And in these scenes, quiet, cold, and devoid of triumph, they understood fully that the Ardennes offensive had not failed suddenly, but had slowly bled out along miles of forest roads, undone by the very fuel on which it had wagered its success. By the final days of December, snow and smoke mingled across the battlefield, marking the end of Germany's last major offensive in the West. What had begun as a bold attempt to alter the course of the war had become a costly demonstration of what Germany could no longer sustain. The tanks that were meant to roll into Antwerp had instead become frozen monuments to a strategy that underestimated the unforgiving realities of terrain, logistics, and enemy resilience. And as the remnants of the German spearheads prepared to withdraw, the truth became undeniable. The offensive had been defeated not only by Allied strength, but by the quiet inevitability of empty fuel tanks. When the German offensive finally began to recoil under the weight of its own exhaustion, the battlefield revealed the scale of the losses incurred during the Ardennes gamble. Snow-covered roads were lined with burned-out tanks, shattered half-tracks, overturned trucks, and artillery pieces abandoned in ditches. Many of these machines had not fallen to American fire, but to the silent betrayal of empty fuel tanks. The offensive had consumed Germany's last reserves of mobility, and the vehicles that littered the forests and villages stood as a stark testament to a military power that had reached beyond its remaining strength. Experienced tank crews, irreplaceable mechanics, seasoned officers, many had been lost in battles that gained little ground and yielded no strategic advantage. Germany had committed some of its best remaining formations, including elite panzer divisions, into an operation whose success depended on perfect conditions that never arrived. Logistically, the cost was even more devastating. The fuel burned during the Ardennes offensive represented not just a temporary expenditure, but the depletion of resources that Germany could never replenish. Synthetic fuel plants had been bombed into ruin, transportation networks were collapsing, and stockpiles were already reduced to a fraction of what had been available earlier in the war. Every liter consumed in the Ardennes meant another unit elsewhere in Germany would receive nothing. By January, commanders reported entire armored brigades unable to maneuver, artillery batteries short of ammunition, and supply convoys grounded for lack of gasoline. The Ardennes had not only failed, it had drained the lifeblood needed to defend the Reich in the months ahead. Strategically, the failed offensive shattered any remaining illusion that Germany could dictate the pace of the war. For a brief moment in December, the sudden breakthrough had sown panic and confusion among Allied lines. But once the attack stalled, the psychological advantage evaporated. American and British commanders quickly recognized that the offensive, far from signaling renewed German strength, had exposed the last reserves of its offensive capability. The Wehrmacht had concentrated its remaining armor, manpower, and supplies into a single thrust, and when it faltered, the loss reverberated across the entire Western Front. This was not an enemy capable of sustained campaigns. It was an army fighting its final, desperate battles. Allied leaders understood that the Ardennes would be the last time Germany could mount such a large-scale attack. The road to the Rhine and into Germany itself was now clearer than ever. The human cost within the German command structure was equally significant. Officers who had once spoken in cautious optimism now described the offensive in terms of regret and resignation. Many admitted privately, and later publicly, that the plan had been fatally flawed from the beginning. They recalled the shortages, the unrealistic objectives, the dependence on captured fuel, and the terrain that offered no room for error. Some viewed the Ardennes as a political operation masquerading as a military one, designed more to satisfy Hitler's desire for dramatic action than to achieve achievable objectives. The failure of the offensive deepened the sense of fatalism that had already taken hold in parts of the German leadership, convincing even the most loyal commanders that the war was entering its final, irreversible stage. On the Allied side, soldiers who had survived the first shock of the attack walked through forests littered with destroyed German armor and understood that they were witnessing the collapse of an army that had once seemed unstoppable. The wreckage told a story more clearly than any intelligence report. Germany had launched a final throw of the dice and lost. What remained was a weakened, overstretched force that could no longer withstand the combined weight of Allied material strength, air superiority, and logistical depth. The battlefield itself became the bridge to the next phase of the war, a transition marked not by celebration, but by the cold realization that the hardest fighting still lay ahead. Yet for the Allies, the strategic picture had changed permanently. The Ardennes offensive had not reversed the tide of war. It had accelerated Germany's defeat. And as the last echoes of combat faded through the winter woods, commanders across the Allied front prepared to carry the war through the final barrier that remained, the borders of the German homeland. In the weeks following the collapse of the Ardennes offensive, Allied commanders studied the battle with a clarity sharpened by the shock of its initial impact. The surprise had been real, and it had exposed weaknesses in intelligence interpretation, sector security, and assumptions about German capability. Yet the rapid stabilization of the front, followed by the successful counteroffensive, revealed something deeper. The Allies possessed a logistical and industrial strength that Germany could no longer challenge. The fuel that had fueled the Allied war machine, thousands of barrels moved daily across France and Belgium, stood in stark contrast to Germany's scarcity. It became clear that while the Germans had gambled everything on capturing Allied supplies, the Allied armies could afford to lose depots, torch convoys, and still continue advancing. This difference in capacity shaped how the Allies prepared for the next phase of the war. They reinforced their rear areas, reorganized supply routes, and placed new emphasis on guarding stockpiles that had previously been considered safe. The Ardennes had shown that even a beaten enemy could still strike with force, and complacency was a luxury the Allies would no longer permit themselves. The lessons extended beyond logistics. American commanders recognized the importance of flexibility, how quickly an army could pivot, redirect reserves, and shift focus in response to an unexpected threat. Patton's rapid movement north to relieve Bastogne became a symbol of operational agility, demonstrating that speed and coordination could offset even a well-planned enemy assault. Allied units that had been scattered or overwhelmed in the first days of the offensive regrouped and fought with determination once their leadership grasped the scale of the attack. The battle had begun with confusion, but it ended with a level of discipline and cohesion that confirmed the maturity of the Allied force. As they prepared to resume their advance toward the Rhine, the confidence that emerged from this experience strengthened their resolve. At the strategic level, the Ardennes offensive reshaped Allied expectations for the final months of the war. The sheer number of German casualties, the loss of armored formations, and the depletion of fuel and equipment meant that Germany no longer possessed the ability to conduct major offensive operations. The Wehrmacht stood on the defensive everywhere, its armies stretched thin across fronts that were collapsing under pressure from both east and west. For Allied planners, this meant that the final penetration into Germany could proceed with fewer fears of surprise attacks. The offensive capability that had once defined the German army had evaporated in the snowy forests of the Ardennes. The battle also served as an enduring reminder of the fundamental role logistics played in modern warfare. Historians would later describe the Ardennes offensive as an operation defeated by arithmetic more than by firepower, a calculation of fuel, distance, and time that Germany could not escape. The Allies internalized this truth. They improved their supply lines, increased truck production, refined their depot distribution, and ensured that the coming push into Germany would not be hindered by the same vulnerabilities that had allowed the offensive to begin. The destruction of German synthetic fuel production, combined with the losses at the Ardennes, had ensured that the Luftwaffe and remaining panzer divisions could no longer respond with meaningful strength. By early 1945, as the Allied armies prepared to cross the Rhine, the memory of the Ardennes remained vivid. Soldiers marched past the abandoned wreckage of German armor, past frozen corpses and shattered villages, aware that they were closing in on the final chapter of the war in Europe. The German army they now faced was no longer capable of sustained resistance. And yet, for the Allies, the lessons of the Ardennes ensured that caution and respect for the enemy's remaining strength would guide every step forward. The offensive that had once threatened to split the Allied armies had instead revealed the fragility of Germany's military machine. It underscored the decisive power of logistics, the resilience of united command, and the importance of recognizing that an enemy's weakness can be as dangerous as their strength when underestimated. With these lessons carried forward, the Allies advanced toward the Rhine not as a force surprised by hardship, but as one shaped by it and strengthened for the final push into the heart of Germany. When the Ardennes forest finally fell silent and the smoke drifted away from the ruined villages and frozen ridgelines, a deeper truth settled across the battlefield. One that spoke not of heroism or failure alone, but of the unforgiving nature of modern war. The captured fuel depot, where a German general confronted the arithmetic of his own offensive, became a symbol of something larger. It marked the moment when ambition collided with reality, when the belief in bold maneuvers and decisive strikes met the limits imposed by industry, logistics, and the sheer weight of material power. The tanks and trucks scattered across the snow were more than wreckage. They were the remnants of a vision that could no longer be sustained. In many ways, the Ardennes offensive revealed the transformation of warfare itself. Earlier conflicts had turned on courage, discipline, and battlefield maneuver. But in the mechanized age, steel, gasoline, and supply lines shaped outcomes as surely as any commander's brilliance. Germany's final offensive in the West failed not because its soldiers lacked determination or skill, but because its industrial foundation had collapsed beneath the pressure of a global war it could no longer afford to fight. The empty fuel barrels and abandoned vehicles illustrated a simple, implacable truth. No strategy, however daring, can escape the physical requirements of movement and sustainment. For the Allies, the Ardennes became both a warning and a confirmation. It warned that underestimating an enemy, even one weakened and cornered, could invite disaster. Yet it also confirmed the overwhelming strength of a logistical system capable of recovering from surprise, reorganizing under pressure, and sustaining armies across entire continents. The contrast between German desperation and Allied depth created a turning point that shaped the war's final months. And so, as history looks back on the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it sees more than a battle. It sees a lesson written in the harsh winter landscape, a reminder that wars are decided not only by bravery and tactics, but by the quiet, relentless forces that fuel them. In the end, the offensive that aimed to reshape the Western Front became a testament to the power of logistics and to the inevitability that follows when a great army runs out of fuel, hope, and time.